Hello and welcome to the BGOV Debate. My name is Christopher Payne and I'm from Bloomberg Government. Today we have two leading economists who've come to talk about some of the most important economic issues facing the country. We have Robert Shapiro, former Undersecretary of Commerce for President Bill Clinton, and Kevin Hassett from the American Enterprise Institute. Well, it's about a year since the passing of the Dodd-Frank law, probably some are calling the most sweeping set of regulations to be enacted on the financial industry since after the Great Depression in the 1930s. But is it part of the problem or is it part of the solution? Rob.
Well, I'd like to address this in both the general and the particular. The question of whether we needed and still need significant regulation of financial institutions, I think that's a settled question. There was a notion of efficient markets, that these institutions would regulate themselves, and that notion was shown to not be applicable in this period. It may have been true in some periods, but not in this period, because we had a financial collapse. It's clear that so long as taxpayers are on the hook, and they will always be on the hook, and so long as a meltdown in the financial system imposes enormous costs on people outside the financial system, that means we need regulation of the level of risk that these institutions take. In certain respects, Dodd-Frank addressed this. In other respects, it didn't. In certain respects, it has an efficient approach. In other respects, it doesn't. I think it's very far from a perfect piece of legislation, and I think it entails certain costs for the economy. The costs of not seriously regulating the financial system so as to protect the rest of the economy, I think is simply not a plausible position anymore. And of course, we've never had real deregulation. We've always had capital requirements, for example. That's a break on risks. Actually, the U.S. banking system is in better shape than the European banking system because Europe accepted the Basel II reduction in capital requirements, and we were still arguing about it and didn't get around to it before the financial crisis. So while I would not defend every aspect of Dodd-Frank by a long shot, I absolutely would insist that economically this is a sector that requires considerably more regulation than it had before the financial crisis.
Okay, Kevin.
Yeah, I think that as we know, Rob is a courageous intellectual that likes to use a basketball phrase, likes to take the ball hard to the hole, and the fact that he was so cautious about supporting Dodd-Frank and did so more in generalities than in specifics, I think is consistent with my view that Dodd-Frank is the worst piece of legislation that I've seen in my entire lifetime. I think that the impact of Dodd-Frank on the future of this country is conceivably going to be horrifying, and that it has to be repealed as soon as possible. Dodd-Frank is lame-brained, horrifying legislation, and let me talk about why. First of all, my colleague at AEI, Alan Meltzer, likes to say that if a bank is too big to fail, then it's too big. If the problem is that we have these big systemically important institutions and that when they start to screw up, then boom, they take the rest of us down with them, then what we need to do is think about how we can reshape the financial sector so there are lots of little guys. We need to create incentives for entry and try to spur competition. Dodd-Frank does the opposite. What Dodd-Frank does is it anoints some subset of the financial sector firms as systemically important. When those firms are known, which they clearly are, then it will be impossible to compete with them, just as it was impossible to compete with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac because they have access to cheaper funds because you know that they're backstopped by the government. these systemically important firms, there are not going to be many of them, will have very, very low cost of funds. The Fed will have essentially dictatorial power over what activities they pursue. And if the Fed is logical about how it allocates responsibility for different sectors of the financial market, then what it would do is it would try to minimize aggregate risk by making the individual firms do different things. So that, like, if you're doing commodity futures and you're doing mortgages, then if you go down, then the other guy might be okay. And so what the Fed is going to have to do over time to minimize systemic risk is more or less break the financial sector up into something like what we used to see with the telecoms, where there are going to be these little local monopolies that have a huge amount of power over their small little sector, or small, big, or perhaps big sector, but a narrow sector of the financial market. And then they won't be competing with each other. They'll have a lot of market power. They'll capture the regulators. And before we know it, then the cost of finance for everybody in society are going to be absolutely enormous. The flip side is if the Fed doesn't do that, so that's what I think is actually going to happen, and that the Fed is going to be more like the FCC than the Fed of old. If the Fed doesn't do that, then the problem is that the systemically important firms are going to then be left a little bit to their own devices. But then what's going to happen, let's say Rob and I are systemically important, when I wake up in the morning and decide what it is that I'm going to buy, then I look at what Rob's got, and then I'm much more likely to buy what he has than what he doesn't, because I know that if we all own that stuff, then collectively the odds of a bailout are like 100%. And so either the Fed cartelizes finance and drives up costs for everybody, or if they're a little slack on that, then what they do is they create this strong incentive to pool risks into the same things. And so the financial institutions will have much more highly correlated risk than they had in the past, and the systemic risk will even be higher. And so either way, we lose.
Well, let me say I agree on one point at least, and that is the alternative to this regulation is to ensure that there are no institutions too big to fail. And I think that in fact is a proposition that certainly in economic terms makes a lot of sense. Politically, it means you're breaking up Citigroup, you're breaking up J.P. Morgan Chase, you're breaking up Goldman Sachs, you're breaking up probably 40 or 50 largest financial institutions in the country. I think that probably would be better for the economy. And if we could get the politicians to do that, I think we could agree. I certainly don't think it's the worst piece of legislation ever passed by a long shot. I think much more destructive, for example, was the decision by both parties to not regulate derivative transactions, which are the biggest part of the global financial system. They were unregulated with respect to their creation. They were unregulated with respect to their sale. They were not traded on public markets, so nobody knew what they were. They were the single most essential element which turned a financial problem into a financial meltdown in 2008 was the lack of regulation of derivatives. So I think that, and one of the most positive aspects of Dodd-Frank is at least partial regulation of derivatives, although the big financial institutions are trying to whittle away at that. If we can't break everything up, Kevin, then we have to look to areas which have evidenced profound market failure at great cost to the rest of us, and bring common sense limits to those areas of activity.
I wouldn't break everything up. I know that we're near the end, but I would just really aggressively study how we can stimulate entry of new competitors, and that's something that we haven't done.
Yeah, I mean, some might argue that systemically important financial institutions, everyone knows who they are anyway, and given higher capital requirements, that actually might give an advantage to smaller banks to actually start lending and gain some market share. I don't know if
that would be a potential positive outcome. The problem is that the regulatory costs are so high that it's going to be very, very hard to motivate oneself to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars it'll take to comply with all these new regulations.
The notion that any change in law or regulation could increase competition for Citigroup and Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase is, to me, just economically implausible, Kevin. It's in theory, yes, but this is not theory. This is a financial system in which a handful of institutions control the majority of capital in the United States. And no matter what you do to barriers to entry, unless we're going to give, 10,000 people $100 million each to found their own investment banks, that's simply inadequate as a response to the dangers of systemic risk. And that pushes you back to regulation.
Okay, well, thank you both very much for coming in. Thank you, Kevin Hassett. Thank you, Robert Shapiro.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. Thank you.